Okay, for this next project, we're going to be working much more immersively. We're going to be building large constructions that somehow fit on the body. You just watched the videos on Nick Cave, also Daniel Lismore, and Scott Seekins. And no, Scott Seekins doesn't necessarily make his own adornment. His clothing is his clothing. But both Nick Cave and Daniel Lismore are obviously constructing and building these wearable costumes or sculptures. So we're going to take a tour of my studio, and I'm going to show you, some of the things that I work on, and how this project sort of came to be. So I'm going to just walk you through here. We're going to be working with the basket reed. Some of you have already started playing around with that. This is a kind of a maquette or a sculptural model of something that I made that is much bigger. I think I showed the actual piece to you in the introduction. But this is done with the basket reed. And if I zoom in on some of these areas here, hopefully you can see this. The basket making reed is pretty flexible. And I've just wired things together using that thin gauge wire that you all have. You've got the two spools of wire. These are just connected and kind of held together. They're flexible, but these little connection pieces are holding, and you can see there's hundreds of them in here. So I'll show you this technique. These are much larger sculptural pieces that I've been working on. These are done with ash. It's a type of wood, and it's all steam bent. We're not going to get into that, but you can at least see, the size and scale of these sculptural pieces that I'm working on for, suspended sculpture. Still has that same kind of quality as the basket making reed. Very curvilinear, but still fairly geometric. This is just a darkened black version. I do this by burning the wood, actually. But here is a little maquette or another model that I used, and I made this for the 3D design class that I did last year. And this is more in keeping with what we're going to be doing for this project. This piece has been created using the two different gauges of wire that you have in your kits. Some of the pieces are done with the larger gauge, some of them are done with the smaller gauge, and they're just wired together in a very kind of neat fashion. And this takes a little bit of practice to figure out how to do these little wraps, but it's not that difficult if you practice, especially with a thin gauge wire. The thinner gauge wire is definitely easier to work with. And then what we're doing is we're spanning some of the areas with tissue paper, okay? So this tissue paper is glued in place using the Elmer's glue that you have. And I will kind of walk you through the process of this. Again, takes time. This is not something that happens quickly. I'm giving you plenty of time to come up with your own work. It's a very intuitive way to work because it's really hard to have, a design in mind. You're really working intuitively, letting the materials kind of dictate how the process and what the final result is going to look like. So I've got a couple of smaller pieces here that I will show you. Okay, so I've got some just smaller models or maquettes, we call them in the arty-farty world. This is one with the basket reed, and what I'm showing you here is just different ways to connect pieces together. Like I said, the basket making material is very curvilinear, and you let the material, sort of help you with your design. So this big long curve out here is just something that it kind of supports itself. I can't get far enough away. That curve sort of supports itself out there because it has resistance and resilience. But this piece just kind of evolved as I was playing. The way that we attach the material together is, well, there's a couple different ways to do it. This version here, if I'm showing you how to connect this curved piece here to this piece, is done with a little gusset in here. And that's just a piece of the flat reed that I've cut with scissors into this little triangular wedge. And it gets glued with hot glue on the back side in here, if you can see that. It just gets glued together, and that provides a little bit more mechanical structure for these two pieces to hold together. Another way that you can do it is just by gluing this reed to this post here with a dab of hot glue. And what I do is I get the hot glue on there and I just hold on to it until it cools. And, you know, if you've got delicate fingers, and most people do, it can be a little uncomfortable. My fingers have been through the ringer because I'm a metalsmith. I'm picking up hot things all the time. My fingers are a little bit numb to the pain. So it is possible to glue these things end to end. You can give it a try and see if you can handle it, but I'm guessing it's going to be a little bit painful for you. Let's go back over to this piece. You know, you can see how these are wired together. They're not directly wired together. They're kind of removed from one another with this wire, I don't know, we'll call it a stretcher bar or something just to hold it apart. But the wires are wrapped. Let's see if I can get a focus here. Can't focus that close. The wires are wrapped around the reed a couple of times. Okay, so hopefully you can see some of these things. I'll take photos and drop them in so that you can get a better view. But that's another way to do it. And I have a sample here of kind of a T-joint. There is a little bit of hot glue in there, but then I wrap the wire around the joint to hold things in place. And again, I will take photos of this and I'll show you how I do this process too. And then I will go into the process of putting the tissue paper across here. All right. So I've got a couple of different thicknesses of the reed. I've got the real thick stuff here, the 1/8 inch or so round material here, and then this is some of the flat basket making reed. I also have some tape, and I'm going to show you a really quick and easy way to connect these pieces. I just take a piece of masking tape and I rip strips of the masking tape like that, and you know, maybe take a 1.5 to 2 inch piece, and you can connect them using masking tape. So if I've got, you know, these two pieces that I want to connect here like that, I could potentially do something like this and just wrap the masking tape around and try to make it as neat as you can. But I wrap it a couple of different ways. I will maybe go this way. And that can create a relatively strong way to, oops, bouncing the camera, to connect these pieces. And it actually doesn't look terrible, right? That's how I connected these together, just by wrapping. You know, try to make them look as nice and neat as possible. They're pretty decent. We're probably going to be wrapping tissue paper over some of these joints, not all of them, but that is one way to cover up some of this. The nice thing about masking tape is that the color tone is almost identical. So you know, from a distance, you almost don't notice it as much. I mean, it's a little bit bulkier, but it sort of softens that joint just a little bit. So masking tape is definitely one way to go about this. It's probably the fastest way. And if you don't like the way you put it on there, you just cut it off and try again. So that's one method. Another method is to use hot glue. I'm going to cut this, and let's see, I'm going to connect these two here like this using hot glue. And just be careful. Don't use too much hot glue. Hot glue is a weird substance. It gets very stringy and it can get all over the place really quickly. So a little dab out here on the end. And I can take this and just push those two together. And then I just hold on to it. It's a little bit warm. It's not awful, but hold on to it until it cools off just a little bit. Be careful because you're obviously gluing your fingers to your piece. And once that cools, it makes a pretty strong joint. Hot glue gets very stringy, so try to break off all of those little stringy bits. So there's a joint there. This works pretty well, and like I said, it's a little warm. It's not terrible though, so see if you can handle that. If not, you might have to come up with different ways. So there's a pretty good joint now that it's cooled off. You can see it's pretty strong. Again, with the basket making material, this reed has sort of a curve to it already. You can tighten those curves by bending them down and gluing them in place, or even wiring them in place, or taping them in place. You might use a combination of all of these methods. I sort of like this look of the mechanical wire on there. Again, it takes a little bit of practice to figure out how to make this look nice and neat, but this is a pretty strong joint because even if the glue fails, you've got this second backup material in the wire. You can also do combinations of wire and reed. If you want sharper curves, the basket reed will only curve so much. And when we're thinking about jewelry, we may need to have something that is a sharper curve if it's going to be wrapping around your arm or something like that. So making some components out of wire and then bridging the wire to the reed is one way to connect these together. So I've got this. Actually, this piece is wrapped here. It comes down, makes a hard bend, does this, and comes up and attaches to itself. And then this down here is just a bridge between the two. So that stabilizes this. And then the tissue paper skin wraps around the reed all the way over to this corner and around here. And then it also wraps the wire. So once the tissue paper dries, it creates this skin. And that adds visual volume to the piece, because if we were just doing this area out here, let me back up a little bit. Looking at this is very linear and very beautiful, but we want to add some volume to a very linear form. And that's what the tissue paper does. That tissue paper skin adds volume. And so the idea behind this is that we're going to make a structure that fits on the body somehow, somewhere, out of the reed. And then we're going to apply this skin, which stabilizes the piece too. This adds a lot of rigidity to the piece and it prevents things from coming apart. But it also adds visual interest. And so what the idea for this project is to create a curvilinear form, an armature of sorts that fits on the body. And then we're going to add the skin to develop kind of a 50-50 ratio of volume to line. So about half of the skeleton structure should be filled in with the tissue paper. So that's your goal, and that's your task.